I'm an author, I'm a curator. I curate shows internationally, most recently this year in Baltimore and also in Tokyo, most recently. And I want to talk you through my thinking and my approach to curating, but also, if you'll indulge me, I want to do some personal background stuff beforehand. Get into some of that. So, yes, I was born in London, which is where I still live. But when I was about 2 years old, my family moved to Ghana, which is where our family is from. And we lived there for about 3 years, and then we came back to Britain. And 3 years in itself isn't necessarily a very long time, but it was enough anyway for that experience of being in Ghana, being in West Africa, being in Africa, to, in a way, form a solid part of my life. And returning to Britain after that was disconcerting. This was the 1970s, and Britain was a place steeped in racism. There were racist comedians on TV, black soccer players who were being spat at by their fans. It was a crazy time. It was kind of intense. And Africa, the place I'd known in the years immediately before that, the place I'd known as a place that was warm and sophisticated and cosmopolitan, was reduced in the popular imagination to a place of mud huts and primitive savages, a place untouched by progress, the antithesis of Western civilization. And to me, as a child, this was offensive. And it was also hurtful because some of this would be directed at me personally. It's kind of racist slurs, all kinds of things. But really what struck me most was the jarring sense of displacement I experienced. The experience of being othered, of being made a stranger, becoming the object of someone else's gaze, the subject of their fantasies. All of this is what I experienced, and all of this really has stayed with me ever since. W.E.B. Du Bois, the great scholar of race, coined a term for that experience of being othered and made strange, being subject to someone else's gaze. Back in 1897, Du Bois coined the term double consciousness to describe what he called the peculiar sensation of living as a black person physically within and psychologically outside white society. Now, the thing is, for Du Bois, double consciousness was the defining criterion of blackness. It was the bitter proof that we as black people would always be excluded from the main body of society, that we'd be doomed to spend our lives in embodied alienation. And that description just rings true to this day. Double consciousness, I think, is an important way of understanding race and identity. But subsequent to that, I've also come to think about double consciousness as more than just pain or alienation. I would suggest, having thought about it, that double consciousness also offers something else. It offers the ability to view the world, I would suggest, with a nuance and a complexity less readily accessible to those not obliged to undertake a daily reckoning with their own personhood. And I think I've come to see the other side of double consciousness as a consequence, really, of the growing up that I did do in the 1980s and the 1990s. And when I say this, I'm thinking of a period really from about the early 80s to, let's say, the mid-90s, when it seemed to me that culture, kind of distinct to the experience I had in the 70s, that culture in the mid-80s early 80s to mid 90s, that culture was predicated, in fact, on the embrace of complexity and hybridity. So when I say this, I'm thinking of a period of post-structuralist and postmodern thought. I'm thinking about Baudrillard, thinking about Barthes, thinking about Derrida, Foucault, theorists, that is, who challenged the idea of a single order of truth or knowledge and argued instead for an understanding of culture and society as fragmented, subjective, decentered. And at the same time, this period of whatever we call it, high theory, post-structuralist theory, postmodern thought, at the same time, this was also the era of early hip-hop, of scratching and sampling, which to my mind formed a kind of sonic articulation of that high-end critical theory. It made sense physically and orally of this idea of a flattening of hierarchies, a kind of space of ideas and imaginaries that's perpetually mutable. So as well as Baudrillard, there was Afrika Bambaataa. As well as Derrida, there was Public Enemy. And the same, I would suggest, was also true in music. So, for example, this was also the age of image appropriation, the kind of visual sampling that the pictures generation took part in, Cindy Sherman, Richard Prince, and others. And what particularly excited me was also seeing the evolution of a wave of black artists on both sides of the Atlantic who worked with notions of hybridity, of a flight from authenticity, and understood culture and the making of identity as contingent, fluid terms rather than a fixed territory. You saw that, for example, in the artists in the 1994 Black Male exhibition, curated by Thelma Golden at the Whitney. You know, artists like David Hammond and Lorna Simpson, Carrie Mae Weems, Glenn Ligon, Fred Wilson. And also in a generation of black artists in Britain that first came to the fore in the early 80s. And here I'm thinking about people like John Okomfora and the Black Audio Film Collective, as well as Isaac Julian, Lubaina Himid, Sonia Boyce. Artists who've all continued to have, on both sides of the Atlantic, kind of spectacular careers because I would suggest they've been able to understand and articulate how we might read our position in the world with a nuance, with a complexity, and looking especially at those black artists in Britain. It was thrilling at the time to see how their work proceeded from an outsider's perspective that privileged an understanding of society as complex, as hybrid, as open to constant interpretation. Describing those British artists, Stuart Hall, who was the preeminent cultural theorist of Britain during that period, wrote of the complex interactions of race and place and aesthetics in their work. He said, instinctively, they work across cultural boundaries and vocabularies. They work with and on difference. But they do not have a binary either-or conception of it. They know that everyone comes from somewhere, speaks from someplace, is multiply positioned, but they don't see cultures as autonomous, self-sufficient entities that bind people forever into common scripts or seal them off from a wider dialogic conversation. And I would suggest that all of that thinking has shaped me. To this day, I believe in the power of difference. I believe in the beauty that can come from looking from the outside in, that can come from double consciousness, the beauty that comes from understanding culture, society, identity as fluid, not fixed propositions. So I work mainly on group shows when I curate exhibitions. And in that role, I'm often having to make new or unanticipated connections between artists. The curator's role is not just to show the work. And actually, this is the thing. It's like people are very confused by what curators actually do. What do we do all the time? So you select the work. Anyway, a lot of it's about making decisions. It's about making, you have to make judgments, but on what basis are you making these decisions about which works to show and how to show them? So I do group shows, and so that work is both about bringing artworks into context and into conversation. It's not just showing the work, it's presenting an environment for the work. It's establishing the terms of discourse within which we might read that work. It's creating an environment of encounter. The theorist and philosopher Hannah Arendt once said that the world is not humane just because it's made by human beings. And it does not become humane just because the human voice sounds in it, but only when it has become the object of discourse. However much we are affected by the things of the world, however deeply they may stir and stimulate us, they become human for us only when we can discuss them with our fellows. So, discourse, difference, fluidity, finding meaning through juxtaposition. These are some of the key tenets of how I try and work as a curator. Let me illustrate that with some of my recent exhibitions. I did a show in 2022 called In the Black Fantastic at the Hayward Gallery in London. This was a show that looked at black artists turn into the speculative and the mythic in their work. So this is a show that featured Nick Cave and Colleen Smith, Chris Ofili and Rashad Newsom. The artists in the show were united by an understanding of race as a socially constructed fiction rather than a scientific truth. A fiction, albeit, that maintains a determining sway over how, in fact, we all see the world. And they also operated with a skepticism about Western narratives of progress and modernity, predicated as they were on the historical subjugation of peoples of color, the hierarchization of ideas of Western knowledge over ideas of African culture and being as somehow backward. The work of the artist in the exhibition, even as it looked towards the future in some cases, for me posed a central question. If, for black people, reality often means living within a fantasy of blackness as the other, as stranger, as alien, then the query comes. How should we live? How should we survive? And the answer, as proposed in the works in the exhibition, in the Black Fantastic, the answer that would suggest that the artists themselves suggest through their work is that by conjuring our own fantasies We come to a new place of being. Fantasy, the fantastic, becomes not a means to escape, but a way to scrutinize the everyday and then to reach beyond it. Nick Cave, Chicago-based artist Nick Cave. In the year 1991, Nick Cave is watching TV, and he sees black motorist Rodney King being beaten, this famous incident that is very well known. Police beat Rodney King. They call him an animal, they call him a beast. They say he is bear-like. He has superhuman strength. He is like a wounded animal, like a mean dog, they say. They blame Rodney King for his own beating, and then obviously they are acquitted in the court of law. Nick Cave is watching this, and he's watching this case unfold. And in response, in despair, but also anger, he makes the first of his sound suits. We see one of them here. Today there are more than 500 of these sound suits. And for anyone who's not familiar with these sound suits, these are part sculptural objects, part costume, part armor. We presented them as, on mannequins, but you can wear them, you can dance in them. The sound suits are made from beaded necklaces, sometimes, or embroidered flowers or stuffed animals, vintage toys, ceramic figurines. The bright colors and elaborately decorated surfaces of the work are a riposte to conventional registers of racial identity. They transform the body, altering height and proportions, turning the epidermal exterior into patterned fantasia. Beauty, color, pattern. Again, these are not they're an escape or a retreat. They're a mode of resistance. They're an assertion of being seen and choosing to be seen on one's own terms, however spectacular or strange one might choose to orient oneself. In other words, beauty, color, pattern come to the aid of inquiry and criticality. The works look dazzling, but they're also serious. And all of the artworks in the exhibition, in different ways, spoke of a way of navigating in the world. And for me, when I started to think about both the show and the artworks in it, it seemed to me that we might best understand the fantastical nature of these works, the Black Fantastic, not as a movement or a rigid category, so much as a way of seeing, a way of being, a way of walking in the world, of conjuring worlds that made sense of the fraught experience of the racialized everyday by this embrace of fantasy as a zone of creative and cultural liberation. And when I made the show, I called it not just The Black Fantastic, but In the Black Fantastic. Deliberately so. So with that in, I wanted to suggest the idea of the Black Fantastic as an active, not a passive condition. So the Black Fantastic was not just a term, it was a space to explore, a terrain to occupy. The intention of the show was an invocation, a coming into being of a physical experience. The exhibition as a site of encounter. One could come face to face with a sound suit, with many of the other works in the show. And I took a similar approach with a more recent exhibition, an exhibition called Black Earth Rising, which I showed at the Baltimore Museum of Art just earlier this year in the spring. So Black Earth Rising explored the ties between colonialism and climate change, seen through the work of artists of African diasporic, Latin American, and Native American identity. So the show featured artists including Yinka Shonibara, Wangechi Mutu, Alejandro Pinheiro Bello, who's a Cuban artist, Cuban painter. And the show looked back historically to the colonization of the Americas in the 16th century, an event which marked the rise of plantation agriculture, the forced migration of enslaved peoples from Africa to the Americas, and the emergence of global commerce. The show suggested or identified these transformations as laying the groundwork for our modern world. Our modern world, based as it is on unsustainable resource extraction and deep economic and environmental disparities between the global north and the south. Against this backdrop, the artists in the show grapple with the lasting impacts of displacement, dispossession, settler colonialism, while also invoking the natural world as a source of renewal and resistance and liberation. And this is the point I want to emphasize, that looking at or thinking about these complex histories, climate crisis, colonialism, is not in itself antithetical to an assertion of beauty. It's not antithetical to an exhibition that can embrace colour, pattern, wonder, beauty. And really, this is what artists themselves do. They have the capacity to hold complexity and contradiction all at once, sorrow and beauty, mourning alongside an assertion of aliveness. So, for example, the work of Teresita Fernandez, who has shown here at SITESANTAFE, I know, he's a wonderful artist. This is a piece called Fire, America 2. The painting depicts a blazing nocturnal landscape, flames roaring across an open plain, billowing into a black sky. The work is actually composed of small glazed ceramic tiles, each of them glimmering with individual light, each of them themselves created through fire. And for Teresita Fernandez, the artwork refers to, she says, contemporary American violence, the history of power, the conquest and destruction of land, the claiming of land, the erasure of people's presence from land, the mapping and redrawing of it. And yet, also, the same work is a hymn to fire as the material for renewal. The same work celebrates the techniques of slash and burn used by indigenous peoples historically in the Americas to shape and cultivate the land. So we have destruction and renewal. We have violence and the capacity for rebirth, all held in tension in one work. See something similar at play in this painting by the artist Frank Bolin. So Frank Bolin is a British, Caribbean abstractionist. To my mind, he's Britain's greatest living abstractionist. He's 92 or 93 this year, still making paintings, still making extraordinary work at scale. But this is from a series of paintings that Frank Bolin made between 1968 and 1971 called the Map Paintings, where he created this series of paintings, including this one, which feature, if you look closely, you can see a stenciled landmass of South America and Africa. Maybe you can see the shapes of the continents within the picture plane. by centering the southern hemisphere, the land masses of the southern hemisphere in this series of paintings, Bolin offers a radical shift of perspective. He invites a shift of gaze away from a Western-centric cartography to one that's actually, in fact, reflective of his own experience as a Caribbean immigrant to the United Kingdom and later to the United States. He gestures, in other words, to the large-scale displacements of Africans to the Americans during the transatlantic slave trade, to the diasporic experience and existence of black peoples in the 400 years from then onwards. And by reorienting the map to reflect that African diasporic perspective, the works in the map painting series also then gesture to these larger legacies of colonialism. They highlight the historical shifts in both human lives and landscapes caused by that forced migration. And at the same time, this work and the whole series are dazzling paintings, paintings of exceptional scale and beauty and force. I showed 2 of these works in the exhibition. 2 was enough. They filled the back wall. And then you couldn't put anything beside them. It's so compelling. I want to look at one more work from this exhibition. This is Riverside Scene by Tyler Mitchell. Tyler Mitchell is an artist and photographer. And in this work, Tyler Mitchell conjures an Arcadia, black utopia. He asks us perhaps to imagine a world where being black does not mean existing in the long shadow of slavery. A world where you are free to paint or to picnic in the open air and in the long grass. We are free to wade in the water. There is joy in that proposition, but also sorrow too, because Mitchell staged this photograph in the South, in rural Atlanta. He grew up in the South, he grew up in Atlanta. And we might imagine, therefore, that beyond the frame of this photograph, are all the histories of segregation, Jim Crow, lynchings in the woods that are part of that Southern history of race and place and being. The exhilarating thing about this photograph is the balance it holds between the history and the facts beyond the frame and the possibilities summoned within it. Both states of being are true, historical fact, but also yearning and possibility and dreaming as a real experience, as a lived experience, as a desire. So here, a free world we see is summoned into reality. This photograph brings to mind for me the work of the Martinican philosopher Edouard Glissant, who wrote of the possibility of a new world, a better world, that he summed up with his concept of relation. It's probably the French term relation or something like that, but let's call it relation. So relation was a way of speaking, was a way of Glissant, was a way that Glissant spoke of a world predicated on affinity rather than social or racial hierarchy, on kinship and connection instead of domination. A world formed, as Glissant wrote, from the meeting, the shock, the harmony and the disharmony that comes with embracing rather than rejecting difference. This is always on my mind when I'm curating exhibitions. to finish, I want to show you some images from an exhibition from last year, The Time Is Always Now, which opened at the National Portrait Gallery in London and then toured to US cities. So this was a large group show exploring how artists are reframing the black figure in contemporary art. So it featured Amy Sherald and Lubena Himid, Noah Davis and Toy Nagiodotola and Chris Ophelia and many others. Anyway, one thematic section in the show was thematically oriented. One thematic section in the show was called double consciousness. It referred to Du Bois's notion of double consciousness, as I discussed earlier. And introducing that theme into the exhibition raised a question for me. How do you visualize double consciousness in the terms that I wanted to consider it, which is to say both as an articulation of pain, but also as a route way to possibility, to nuance and to complexity? And yes, the answer is through the extraordinary works in the show themselves. This, for example, is a sculpture by the British sculptor Thomas J. Price. So Thomas J. Price works by creating these fictional figures. This looks like a realist sculpture, but it's actually a fictional work that he's created through an amalgamation of multiple sources. So he's taken multiple images and scans of different real people. He's created a fictional figure, heroic in scale, yet also quotidian in manner. Between us, fun fact, when I was talking to Thomas originally, I had in mind he was going to make a small piece, I thought, for the show. Sit discreetly. Artists, they're kind of, then he came out to 8 foot. It's gold. It's kind of great. Had to change the location for it. It was going to be one place, another place. Worked out. It's fine. It's good. It's kind of one of the stars of the thing. But anyway, what I actually want to bring your attention to, as well as the piece itself, and you can see actually the way it stands in harmony, even when you can see in the other side of work by Amy Sherald, just there, they kind of talk to each other in a good way. Anyway, I just wanted to highlight, and I know you can see this, if you look behind Thomas's sculpture, you might be able to see that the wall has slightly different tones and textures to it. You might be able to make that out. Basically, look, the top half of the wall behind there is a uniform dark blue, but the lower half is slightly lighter blue and certainly less evenly applied as a blue. You can see it's kind of mottled in a way. And the reason for that is because the lower half of the wall, the paint is applied by hand. And the idea was to introduce the traces of human presence into the physical nature of the space. So I worked with an architectural team on the design for the space. One of their team, a young black architect, personally painted by hand those walls. So the demarcation line between those different strata is really as high as his arm could stretch. So it really is his marks on the wall, human marks on the wall. The idea was the walls of the National Portrait Gallery could become in themselves an assertion of presence, of black presence, in communion with the artworks. It's not necessarily something you'd notice coming into the show, but the idea, the goal, was to announce something of a different order of priority, of aesthetics, but also ethics that might take place on crossing the threshold from the main body of the National Portrait Gallery into the exhibition. Just that intervention was also a piece the larger goal of the exhibition, which was to reflect on how, through the work of these artists, we might go from looking at the black figure to looking with and from its perspective and from the perspective of the artists. So black presence here is around us in every sense. It's within the sculpture. It's on the walls with the paintings. And it's also of the walls. In other words, we are within difference, within connection. There is no other. There is only us together in relation, as Glissant might say. Perhaps this is a utopian proposition that we can all just get along, as Rodney King once said, why can't we all get along? Perhaps this is a utopian proposition. Perhaps, or especially in our increasingly divided world, such an idea feels fanciful. But what is an exhibition but a proposition for living, or at least looking beyond the everyday? What is an exhibition but an imagining of new possibilities for seeing and being? What is an exhibition but a vision of a world yet to come? A world waiting to be brought to life as soon as we step over the threshold into the space of relation, into the space of our shared imagining. Thank you very much. Thank you.
That was terrific. Thank you very much. The image that's behind you right now seems intended only to be viewed from the perspective that we're looking at it now, not as much sculpture is from a 360-degree perspective. Am I correct about that? And if so, how were the decisions made to display it so that you can only look at it from the front?
Yeah, I mean, so this, as I said, I was presented with a challenge by the artist in terms of the scale of the work. So we had to make some decisions about how to show the work. The same exhibition went on to 3 or 4 other venues nationally and internationally after that, where we were able, in fact, to show it more fully, to offer a kind of a greater spatial dynamic to the show, to the piece. What you can't necessarily see there is how visitors arrived at it. So yes, there's only the front of it visible, but actually you could see it from several different positions in the museum at the same time. So even as the figure is looking out, you approached it from both one angle and another angle. So there was a sense of, I'd like to think there's a sense of dynamism to its presence, because you approached it from different angles. But yeah, there are some limitations to this, and thank you for pointing out some of those. But yes, but also, just one last point. It's important also, the way this figure is posed as a sculpture. As I said, it's both quotidian, but it takes reference from classical sculpture in terms of that pose. There's something that Thomas J. Price does, which is really interesting, which is to focus on the apparently ordinary. Most recently, he had one of these sculptures, the large sculptures in Times Square in New York. And every time he does one of these, well, actually, it's not every time. So he does these large sculptures of imaginary black figures. It's really the thing that I find most interesting about them, the reactions to them, which can be very vociferous in different ways. People find a connection with them, or they find something to abhor in them. The placing of these in the public realm, and in fact, one of the things you're gesturing to, the ability to see this in fullness, has raised all sorts of controversies about what it is we're looking at here. The last time I talked to him, he was still reeling from the Times Square experience, because it summoned all sorts of things. So yes, again, the question comes back to what happens when we look. Do we have capacity to look with? Are we stuck looking at? Can we move beyond binaries of us and them into a sense that we can enter into imaginative empathy or kinship with a figure, even if that figure is itself an imaginary figure, a fictional figure? So someone else had a...
Thank you. It was a wonderful presentation. I appreciate it enormously. I'm just wondering, how often have you been told that someone's work is completely original and has never been done before? Two-part question.
Ooh.
And then, what has been your response?
I don't, you know what? Okay, genuinely, I've never met an artist or someone that represents them that claims to be entirely original. It's a bold move. And actually, generally, what I would say, the conversations I have with artists, I think are, I mean, you know, I'm sure there are artists, people work with artists in this room. I respect them enormously because their capacity towards inquiry. So many artists, most artists maybe, many artists spend a lot of time looking at the work of other artists, historically speaking especially. They're interested in what they can learn, what they can steal sometimes, what they can be informed by. And I've never met, I would definitely be wildly suspicious of someone who claims to be utterly original. And yet, at the same time as that, look, I have this slightly kind of idealized idea of the artist, because I like to think of them as some of the few free people left in our world. Free in that their job is to come up with something new. That's what we ask of them. We ask of them to go to places in their imaginative or emotional realms or depths, and then come back from there with something we hadn't, if not entirely new, that we hadn't necessarily anticipated before. And to bring that back to us, to make that space so that we can share something of their own explorations. So yes, to contradict my answer in a way, every artist does something new. And that's what makes them interesting.
Thank you for this talk. This was great. I have a comment and a question. Comment referring to the first question or comment. At the exhibit at the North Carolina Museum of Art, you could walk around the full sculpture, so that was something you could do. But I'm hoping you could talk a little bit about your comment when you referred to hybridity and complexity in the 80s and 90s. You said it was a flight from authenticity, which I'm hoping you could talk about, because especially in the last, 5 years or so, especially on social media, you see all this like emphasis of being authentic. And so, and I wonder if authentic now is a bit either adulterated, or maybe being authentic back in the 80s and 90s meant something very specific, and that the breakaway from that Was
Yeah,
it different?
I mean, it's an interesting, yeah, it's definitely an interesting question. I would say that I would stand by that characterization as impatience, a flight from notions of authenticity. And to be honest, as a creature of that time, I myself remain suspicious, intolerant even, of ideas of authenticity because they suggest there is only one way to be. There's only a singular truth to that being. And actually, I would say our authentic selves, or the realms anyway that artists explore to this day, hinges upon an ability to embrace the contradictory positions of the self and of society, of ourselves and the world around us. It's very difficult to make work that has depth to it if one insists there's only one way to be. Like, I'll just say this, like, what is this supposed to be, this garden of heroes that President Trump is? Do you know, like, this is a notion of authenticity. There's only one way to read whoever might or might not end up in some kind of place like that, which is this thing that you celebrate someone in these terms alone. The interesting thing I find is to recognize that the facts of being are always contingent, that identities can always be read and reread. And yeah, I would say this was an idea certainly that was current and that was promulgated by theorists and artists in that period. I think the world is more interesting if we hold on to that rather than insisting that one is authentic or inauthentic. And just to finish with that, I'm exercising me personally because at different times people have told me I'm not, I don't know, appropriately authentic, appropriately this, appropriately that. I don't know what even that means. I'm just trying to, do my thing. And that's enough work. It's hard enough. So, I just want to, I value the fact that we all contain multitudes. And I think that's something that's worth holding on to.
Hello, thank you so much for that presentation. It was profound. It seems that you're sort of opening up this idea, to me anyway, as of a curator as a world builder, repositioning the viewer relationally in a way that is poetic. My question is, how do you achieve this? Because as a curator, and I think I read somewhere, a former editor as well, how do you get people to either change or at least open their minds?
Well, I mean, that's that's the job. Look, the really, really simple thing that's not simple. Everything begins with the artists. As I said, I work on group shows, and normally those shows therefore have a proposition at the center that I'm trying to explore. I try not to have some kind of fanciful thing. I try not to have something that's overbearing. I begin really by looking at the work of artists around and abroad and trying to see some of the tendencies that I think are at play in their work, and then trying to make those connections and trying to create a show that then makes those connections explicit. That's the theoretical part. The practical, physical part is, okay, what does the space look like when you enter it? And then there's a third thing. What does the space feel like? And this is, in a way, the least quantifiable part of the experience, but maybe the most important. And I'm trying to think about this a lot at the moment, because the art world, for good reasons, is a world, that is scrutinizing, that spends a lot of time thinking about words and the meaning of words as much as it does the meaning of images. And so words like feeling and empathy and connection, they're quite hard to tie down. What does a feeling mean? Can more than one person share that same feeling if we can't even necessarily put it into words? And yet, the reason why I talk about exhibitions as sites of encounter is because the goal is to create a summoning of spirit, another word that is also deeply contingent, subjective, impossible to pin down, slippery, essentialist even at the most risky. But I'm interested exactly in that. What does it take to establish a space where, as I was saying, some of the hierarchies of sense, knowledge, order, progress, rationality even, are not necessarily the only ones with which we proceed. In other words, it's okay to proceed aesthetically, and the embrace of those aesthetics does not mean a retreat from a criticality. It means that the words we summon, the subjective words we might use, are a little bit imprecise. But they also then hold space for a number of meanings at the same time. I like to proceed into the work and exhibition from a position of unknowing. I don't know how a show will necessarily look when I start it. I don't know how it will feel when I start it. You don't know until all the works are up, until you're in the space. But the test for me comes when I watch other people come in and when the show actually comes to life through the relation between the artworks and the audience. And then the role of the curator is simply just to organize that, to invite, to open the doors towards experience, towards individual interpretation. There is no into that, but this is the mystery of it, the joy of it. I'm not trying to make it sound too mysterious, but yeah, I think feeling is important. And sometimes you can nudge that by doing things with the walls and doing things with the layout. But really the magic, another word, the magic of a show is when you bring all of these works together and something else then starts to happen. And people then discover something they hadn't necessarily imagined before. And even sometimes the artists discover sets of relationships between their works and the works of other artists that they hadn't contemplated. And that's the goal, really, to create something, yes, a world that plays, that is organized according to its own rules.
Hello. Thank you very much. I first wanted to make a comment to say thank you for starting with your personal story. I just can't imagine thinking about doing any job that didn't include a part of me in it. So understanding your process by understanding a little bit about your story and your life makes it more relatable, I guess, or ability to understand.
Thank you.
So my question, I just, a few things that you spoke about that jogged my mind were the question about our artists, are they doing anything new and creative? Are their ideas new or creative? And wondering if curation is a collaborative process? Is it something that you know, all these ideas are your own? Are they prompted by artists that you encounter? And then I'm asking that because I also wanted to ask you if you had any relationship with Koyo Kulu, who recently passed, and what your thoughts would be she'd want to do at the Venice Biennale at this point, especially with the U.S. Pavilion being kind of a complete wreck. Okay, that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, let's work backwards through some of that. Yeah, yes, I knew Koyo. She was a friend. I didn't see her that often because she was in South Africa. I was really excited to see what she was going to do with Venice. I mean, the team she assembled is still working on that brief. So I wait to see. But even the proposition for the show, what is it called? In minor, I can't remember it, in minor key or in minor chord or something like that, I think, feels exciting and resonant to me. And to work backwards, the making of exhibitions, the curating of exhibitions, is not a solitary exercise. That's actually the joy of it. So with the museum shows that I work on, this one, for instance, and the other ones I've shown you, I have a team that I work with internally at each museum. The ideas are mine. I come up with a proposition, I propose that to the museum, but then after that, they appoint a team. And sometimes it's 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. You're working together across the whole process. And actually, one thing with that, so one of the things I do find really interesting, so I have this, it means across that period of time, I have a relationship with a museum that lasts for that amount of time. And it starts off with a small group, the curatorial team that I work with, that's maybe 3 or 4 people, and we're working closely on the show. And then actually across the course of those years, it gradually expands and expands. Certainly this was the case with the portrait gallery, for example, but in each case, because the closer the show gets, you are working with the installation team, but you're also working with advancement and fundraising, but you're also working with press, marketing, interpretation. You end up working across the whole thing. And the reason I mention that is because with all of them, with every single team, and as that develops, I have to explain to all of them what the goal of the show is. And more than just what the show is about, how we collectively might speak of it. So this comes back to my earlier point about these loose terms like feeling, mood, tone. I actually want to share a conversation with the whole museum that allows us to speak in less rigid terms about what the work is, about what the goal of the exhibition is. So part of what I do is try and introduce something of a different lexicon that comes into play so that we can speak with all the rigor necessary about the work, but we can also do something else. We can also then have a shared conversation, which perhaps also then is shared with the visitors that come through the doors, which is, again, this thing. What does this feel like? What does it feel like to be in this space? What does it feel like to be in company with these works? And how might that feeling then extend into how we see each other and the world around us?
I am an MFA student at the Institute of American Indian Arts, and I'm writing my thesis, and a lot of what you're saying is correlating to what I'm researching about hybridity. And I'm really interested in you going back to Ghana, and what was that like? And is that how you came to this idea of these like terms of like outside looking in and double consciousness? And because that's sort of what I'm growing up on and off the res. I feel that sort of similarities. And if you could talk about that, that'd be great.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you for that question. So it took me, some of that experience of being othered, of feeling an outsider, feels very personal. It feels very solitary. And one of the great revelations to me really happened when I was about 18. I don't know, are we filming this? Okay, look, I'm going to share this. I said it before. So, but like, when I was about 18, I was in my local library, Brent Town Hall Library. I was 18, I'm at school, I was living through a bunch of stuff. And I came across a publication. It was it was quite a slim volume. It was the papers from a conference. which it was a conference called Black Film British Cinema. It's about the creation of a new wave of black independent cinema in Britain. And I was looking through this thing. I had pictures in it. I was looking at the pictures. I was looking through it, and I came across an essay by a theorist who I quoted earlier, Stuart Hall, preeminent cultural theorist. And it was an essay by Stuart Hall talking about identity, talking about difference, talking about hybridity, talking about identity. And Stuart Hall talked about identity as an unfinished conversation, as a process always in the making, as a fluid state, not a fixed state. And he put into words exactly these feelings. It turned out, I discovered through reading him in Brent Town Hall Library, that all of the things I'd been feeling since childhood, this experience of being outside, looking in, displacement, uncertainty, duality. Well, others had been thinking about these. Others had been talking about these. Others had been writing about these. This was extraordinary to me because I thought I was alone. And then it turned out there was a whole conversation taking place. I was blown away by this, to the extent and the reason why I was on the campus. So I took this publication, I smuggled it on the phone, Jack. I took it home. I had it with me for about 20 years. And because it changed my life. It changed my life because I realized that all of the things that I found difficult and so on, yeah, had a name, others had talked about them, and that that was not an end, but a beginning point for yet further way to see the world. A world in conversation with others who were exploring some of those conditions and found through them a route towards creativity, a route towards new imagining. That really set me off in terms of everything I've done since then, writing, curating, editing, anything, begins from a belief, it begins from a basis of understanding that difference is an invitation towards inquiry, that one's social place is both a solitary condition, but also involves in itself the possibility of solidarity, of connection, of reaching towards. So yeah, these things remain a discovery. The delight of my life every morning is waking up, realizing there's more to do. There are more ways to express how we live. There is more nuance yet to tease out of the ordinary daily experience of being. I am not happy at some of the ways that has been constructed and been visited upon me over time, but I am grateful that I've been able, through that, to be able to look at this world around us and realize its strangeness, its beauty, and to do that then in the company of others, of scholars and writers, and of artists who approach each day, in each facet of the day, with an impatience and with a route towards, with a yearning towards discovery, with a sense that, yeah, you can actually make the world anew. You can actually create new worlds, or at least new ways of seeing the world.